Man, Vocab Malone outdid himself with that beat. Can y'all hear me? All right, somebody said yep. All right, let's get to it. I don't have a lot of time. I don't want to chop up this, but let's go ahead and get to it. All right, y'all can see these slides? Let me know if you can see the slides. Gotcha. All right, thank you so much. Welcome to my sessions. I am M.J. Jackson, and we're going to be dealing with the problems of the Kemetic sources. Let me give you a preface. I do not claim to be an Egyptologist. I am a Christian apologist who is concerned about truth. And one of the ways that we worship God is with our mind. And we're going to do that today, right? So let's get right to it, all right? Let's go. All right. Over the last 50 to 60 years, the African American community has experienced something like the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, mainly with the doors to information, both good and poor, being blown off the hinges by the power of technologies, mainly that of the internet and the popularity of YouTube. Based on these developments, we have begun to see somewhat of an urban enlightenment within the African American community, especially amongst millennials. This urban enlightenment centers on the reclamation of what is perceived to be the African identity and the rejection of everything European, or better yet, white. I would say that this type of thinking first started mainly on the religious front with guys like Noble Drew Ali, Farad Muhammad, and Elijah Muhammad. With the rise of these so-called religio-political groups, we began to see efforts to reconstruct an identity based on that of religion. I hope you guys are tracking with me. Now, also during this time, another group of thinkers on the academic front were aiming for the same goals regarding identity, absent any forms of religion. What resulted from this was the black thinkers' assertion of bias in studies like anthropology, history, and archaeology. One important work that began to circulate around this time was that of George Granville Moniah James, who wrote the book Stolen Legacy. He goes on to say in his book is an attempt to show that the true authors of Greek philosophy were not the Greeks, but the Egyptians, i.e. Africans in North Africa, and the praise and honor falsely given to the Greeks belonged to the people of North Africa and therefore to the African continent. He goes on to point out that this theft of the African legacy by the Greeks led to an erroneous world opinion that the African continent has made no contribution to civilization and that the people are naturally backwards. He pointed out that this is a misrepresentation and has become a basis of racism and prejudice. Nevertheless, Dr. Carl Ellis pointed out in his fine work, Free at Last, that many others before James also felt that Western historians had sold us a bill of goods that was portrayed as objective history that was really, in reality, white history, with black history being almost completely glossed over. All right, stay with me, y'all. After this work, which was thought to be groundbreaking for some, the floodgates busted open with a myriad of Afrocentric teachers who put forth doctrines and presented hypotheses of how the great successes of the West pretty much goes back to Africa, and mainly that of Egypt, which is indigenously called Kemet. And in this picture, you will see from left to right. Let's start with the left. You have John Henry Clark, who was big in pushing for Africana study programs to be taught. He was one of the big movers and shakers in the it was going on around the civil rights movement, affirmative action, and things like that within the schools. Next to him is Chancellor Williams, who wrote the book Stolen Legacy. The gentleman standing up is he just passed away in 2015. That is Dr. Ben, who he's called Dr. Ben by most people who love him and things like that, who holds him dear. His Yosef Ben Yaakov, he wrote a lot of books, pushed a lot of information. My favorite is this fella right here, next to him, John G. Jackson. I like John G. Jackson because John G. Jackson cites sources, and I can look up his work. And that is kind of empowering, even though he's wrong. All right, let's keep it going. I hope I'm moving quite along. And this guy is popular today. This is Anthony Browder. These are some of the guys who have pushed Kemet. And don't get me wrong, the civilization of Kemet was indeed great. But on the Christian worldview, we understand that it is God who raises up kings and nations. It's God who guides the destiny of mankind. He also guides the hand of history and points it in the direction that he would. Now, you might be asking yourself this right here. How is this important to Christianity? Okay, what are you getting at, MJ? Well, Dr. Ellis speaks on the fact that many begin to reject Christianity based on the failure to differentiate between white Christianism, Christendom, Christian nationalism. It has many names today, and biblical Christianity, which resulted in the conflation of the two. Okay, a failure, he went on to say that a failure to do homework resulted in the formation of Afrocentric humanism entering the scene, which amounts to an autonomous whole worldview by which culture is deified and made the ultimate arbiter of truth. What do you mean? What do you mean? All right, Stephen, we'll let Stephen Howe break this down. This is a good book. Please get this book. You will love it. Okay. Stephen Howe notes, from all this follows an extreme intellectual and cultural separatism involving a belief in fundamentally distinct and internally homogeneous ways, African way of knowing and feeling about the world, ways which only members of the group can possibly understand, even those are apparently in-group members by birth, ancestry, or pigmentation can be excluded from it on ideological grounds if they fail to accept the ideology's doctrines. For such a failure can be attributed quite simply to brainwashing by the dominant Eurocentric culture. Thus, the belief system is insulated from the possibility of critique or falsification. I would go on to say that go on by saying that the important elements of this reconstructed worldview have centered on that of Kemet, which is basically the crown jewel of Africa, while also maintaining a cultural epistemology. Let's keep going. Now, what about Christianity? Now, by maintaining that some of the world's greatest successes are really owed to Kemet, there are several approaches taken by those who embrace this ideology. We saw with George G.M. James how he felt about Greek philosophy and modern science were ripped off from Kemet. Others who came after him took the next logical step and stated that even religions that are practiced today owed a great debt to Kemet. Some people use this hypothesis to engage in cultural relativism, and others use it as a sword to attack the foundation of the biblical worldview by assuming either an evolutionary view of religion as a whole or a wholesale plagiarism, and the assumption that lies beneath it all is that God has not spoken. Now, for the sake of brevity, I will only interact with the hypothesis that the teachings of the Bible are copied from Kemetic sources. And here it is. After all, if the Bible is indeed a copy or a poor copy, we would at least expect it to communicate a message that is consistent with that which came before us. Let us go on to compare, and hopefully we'll get to all three. Okay, we're going to compare the big three worldview categories which both the Kemetic sources and the Bible communicate. And that is going to be creation, ethics, and salvation. Now, before we get into the meat of this, I want to lay out my method. We will get the whole story, we will look at context, and we will take the parallels on head to head and allow the chips to fall where they may, with no special pleading or ad hoc explanations. All right, remember that with me. No special pleading and no ad hoc explanations. Right. So let's keep going. I hope y'all tracking with me. Okay, so Anthony Browder comes right out. He comes right out with an extraordinary comment, and he says in both the Nile Valley account and the Christian accounts, God is self-created. He creates heaven and earth, divides water, etc., etc. He goes on to state that the parallels between the two religious systems are numerous and striking, and he says all this in his Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization and Anthony Browder, page 86. Now, We could assume that this is the case, but we owe it to ourselves to do a careful comparison between the two accounts. Furthermore, the Bible makes no mention of the logical contradiction of a self-created God, for God would have to pre-exist his creation in order to create himself, and a cause cannot be its own effect. This is a violation of the law of non-contradiction. Let's keep going. And you don't have to take my word for it, but let's also examine the direct sources. So, according to Kemetic Sources, and this can be found in this book, Daily Life of the Egyptian Gods by Christine and Dimitri Meeks, the Creator God then says the following: I brought my flesh into being by my own effectiveness. I am he who created himself. I fashioned myself as I please. I came into being, one who become. I came into being, and becoming became, and all the beings came into being after I come into being. That's page 14 through 16, Daily Life of the Egyptian Gods. He's quoting the coffin text. This is further echoed in other sources, but I'm not going to read them. Things like that. One source has the Creator God coming into being by inhaling my, all that stuff right there. All right. Question: can we find this type of concept can we find this concept in the Christian sources? And let's see. Okay. The biblical worldview presents God as self-sufficient, personal, transcendent, distinct from creation, who in the beginning chose, based on the good pleasure of his will, to bring about creation. Okay. So, on the contrary, the biblical worldview starts with God as self-sufficient. Some people call this the independence of God. Wayne Grudem comments that this attribute of God is sometimes called his self-existence or his aseity. Scripture in several places teaches that God does not need any part of his creation in order to exist for any other reason. No need for mod, right? God is absolutely independent and self-sufficient. Paul proclaims to the men of Athens that the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines. Don't make a statue for him. He doesn't need you to feed his statue. Okay. Paul goes on to say he doesn't live in shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands. So we can look at the very practices of Kemet and see that, everything's different. Since he himself gives life to men and breath and everything in it, the implication is that God does not need anything from mankind. He is personal and transcendent. He is not to be identified in any way with the creation. So there is pantheism right out the door. So let's keep rolling, because this is good. So let's keep rolling. John Walton says a few things. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to read his last few statements. The issue of theogony, okay, and a theogony is simply the birth or the origins of the God. That is a concept that is foreign to the biblical worldview, okay, to the biblical worldview. The most obvious difference is seen in the absence of any theogony in Israel. The biblical text offers no indication that Israel considered Yahweh as having an origin, and there are no other gods to be brought into existence by procreation or separation. Since the cosmos is not viewed as a manifestation of divine attributes, Israel's cosmology develops without any need of theogony. The issue of theogony is likewise foreign to contemporary Christian and Jewish theogony, where God is considered eternally existing. Somebody shout amen. All right, but don't take John Walton's word for it. We have Theophile Obenga, who was the protege of Sheikh Ante-Diop, and he has a few things to say as well. I'm going to just read his next comment on the slide for the sake of brevity, and we'll keep it going. But he points out that Egyptian mythology is radically different. There, the creative demiurge emerges within noon, and only after that begins the work of creation. This is important. There is no independent creator, no demiurge standing apart from creation, born already before the birth of the universe. So we have it from a non-Christian's mouth. This man is a credentialed scholar. He is an Egyptologist, and he says it's different. So I think we should take his word for it. But let's keep rolling. What about what about ethics? Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I really want to talk about Jesus. and I know y'all want to talk about Jesus too. So what I can say about ethics is a lot of times when you're having conversations, or even just sitting on YouTube or Facebook, a lot of people will throw the 42 laws of my aunt. Well, right there, they're trying to pull one over your head, because there's no such thing as the 42 laws of my aunt. There are 42 negative confessions, and there are 42 declarations of innocence. And what we should know about the negative confessions and the declarations of innocence is found in spell 125 of the popularly called the Book of the Dead, or the Book of the Coming Forth by Day. It's going to be found in spell. That's a magical spell, which is also foreign to the biblical text of spell 125. And this is the context of this, and context matters. The context of this spell is a person traveling through the afterlife, going to their final judgment, and pleading, basically reciting that spell, which is the confessions of what a person has not done. Adding to this, MAULANA KARENGA states that the setting for the declarations of innocent is the post-mortem judgment scene found in chapter 125, or spell 125, of the Book of the Coming Forth by Day, whose central themes are judgment, justifications, and immortality. All right, let's get to the 10 commandments, okay? But what about the commandments? All right. I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but what I will say is the commandments are radically different. They are given in a different context. These are actual commandments, but they're given in the context which follows the form of what we would consider today to be a contract, okay? A contract between a great king and a subject. In ancient times, it was called a suzerain treaty, okay? So what John Oswald says, as some readers will know, the form of the covenant between God and the Israelites seems to have been adapted from the form of certain political treaties in the ancient Near East. How closely it duplicates this form, and whether it is the form of earlier or latter period, is a matter of scholarly debate. But that it is essentially the same form is now as widely accepted. It is the form of agreement between a great king, subject people. Among other things, such a treaty spelled out the actions that the king that led up to the signing of the agreement. So you have 42 confessions, 42 assertions that one have not done wrong, so that they don't get annihilated in the afterlife. And then you have God given laws, given a contract that the people are to keep. He is reforming folks who have been pagan slaves, and he's trying to get them right, but he's given them a contract to live by, demonstrating also what he has done for them up to that point. I do not see the connection, so we would have to dismiss the so-called connection as special pleading. So we can clearly see that these are not at all the same, and it's special pleading to keep us certain that one was derived from the other. Let's keep it moving, right? Okay, so this is what I wanted to talk about to you, and we're going to dub it Nile Valley mythicism. So far, we looked at two areas Kemetics point to when attacking biblical Christianity. The last area that I want to speak on is what I call Nile Valley mythicism, and how Kemetics use it to attack the biblical doctrine of the incarnation. All right. In light of this focus that we're taking, the Christocentric approach, the doctrine of the incarnation have very important implications. We see this based on the identity of Jesus and what he was able to perform and the work of his redemption. The second person of the Trinity, the Word made flesh, the Logos, who is the eternal God, took on a human nature and entered into the time-space world. Furthermore, the way that God entered into creation, okay, in Jesus, is open to historical investigation. Okay, this way provided the atoning work for mankind to have peace with God, as the God-man Yeshua the Messiah is the perfect representative between both parties, and provided redemption through his perfect life, his perfect sacrifice, his wondrous resurrection from the dead. Therefore, the Messiah is of great importance. Okay, so the biggest question right now is, what is Nile Valley mythicism? What is Nile Valley mythicism? Okay, the Nile Valley mythicist hypothesis is simply the assertion that the biblical Jesus never existed but was copied and constructed out of Kemetic myths concerning Horus and Osiris. Like all other Nile Valley assertion, this one looks at the success of Jesus and simply assumes that it too must have come out of Kemet. Y'all tracking with me? All right. So I can't spend time on this, but if you're looking at this slide, this is the criteria that real historians use when they're evaluating a hypothesis. You got explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, less ad hoc, illumination. For more on this, please see Michael Licona's work, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, and William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith, page 233. Let's keep rolling, y'all. Okay, we're doing pretty good. Let's keep rolling. Okay. What the Nile Valley mythicist hypothesis puts forth is that by examining the parallels between Jesus, Osiris, and Horus, we should come to the conclusion that Jesus never existed and that the New Testament is mythological in nature. John G. Jackson echoes this when he comments that the Egyptian analogies to the Christian epic are so close in some cases as to suggest an Egyptian origin for certain Christian doctrines and rites, right? That's what he says, okay? Now, we're going to take on these parallels in light of the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I do plan on doing several programs on the reliability of the New Testament after I get through my worldview series, and if nothing pops up in between. So let's just look at this. So we are to examine supposed parallels. One little note about parallel, okay, about parallelomania. How it works. In 1962, in the journal article of Biblical Literature, Samuel Sedman referred to such sloppy scholarship and defined it as parallelomania, which he defined as that extravagance amongst scholars which first overdoes the supposed similarity in a passage and then proceeds to describe the source and derivation as if implying literary connection flowing in an inevitable or predetermined direction. Nile Valley mythicism is parallelomania on steroids. As we have discovered early on, is that religions by definition have similarities in the fact that most believe in some type of origin for reality, most propose some type of remedy for human condition, and most worship some type of God and believe in some type of afterlife. These are often conveyed in shared symbols. But we need to look at whether there is dependence, okay? And we need to describe this dependence in two ways, right? So, a genetic dependence is one where we can trace an idea or belief back to an original earlier source. A dependence of adaptation or contextualization occurs when one borrows words, symbols, or concepts to convey an idea or belief, the substance of which does not originate in any of religion. Okay, so there is a difference between genetic dependence and dependence of adaptation, or what we would also call contextualization. For example, the Apostle Paul adapts the Athenian belief in the unknown God in the speech on Mars Hill to talk about the Christian God. The Father Clement of Rome does the same thing when he says, "Come, I shall show you the logos and the mystery of the logos, and I shall explain to you in images that are known to you." Okay, contextualization is used today by Christian missionaries to communicate the gospel to foreign cultures. Is there any evidence, okay, of genetic dependence of Christian beliefs on pagan religions? Okay, that's a two-part answer: yes and no. Okay, yes and no. However, as biblical scholar Bruce Metzger comments, a distinction must be made between the faith and early practice of the earliest Christians during and that of Christians during subsequent centuries. One cannot deny that post oh, Lord Jesus, I'm getting tongue tied. Christianity after Constantine, good Lord, and which is 4th and 5th centuries, both East and Western adopted a few pagan rites and practices. Okay. For example, mystery religions may have well influenced the selection of December 25th. So we don't ignore the fact that there were pagan influences down the line. Nevertheless, this does not mean that there is evidence to suggest that the basic tenets of biblical Christianity was influenced in the first century. Okay, let me give you an example. First, we do not have any evidence of Kemetic religions being practiced in Palestine in the first century. If you have evidence, please produce it. Okay, are we really supposed to believe that Jews were walking around with the Book of the Dead and knowing how to speak the MAULANA? Okay, if you talk to Bart Ehrman, he will tell you that Jews were illiterate. So are we supposed to, and I take issue with how far he pushes that, but we know for a fact that they wasn't speaking no MAULANA. Okay, this is absurd, and if there's evidence, please produce it. Secondly, behavior like that would have gotten them killed on the spot, for Jews did not tolerate pagan practices or syncretism. In other words, Second Temple Judaism was exclusive and extremely monotheistic. Thank you, people. Furthermore, arguments like these point to a major fallacy behind it, which is first being called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, and the second fallacy is special pleading. Okay, but the first, the post hoc ergo propter hoc, this is the form of a fallacy called the false cause fallacy, and it is committed when a causal connection is drawn between two events or ideas without adequate evidence for such a connection. Okay, so we got some issues going on here. So let's keep it rolling, y'all. I'm trying to get through a few more slides, right? So parallel number one, the virgin birth. I'm not going to say much about this, except to say that Isis was not a virgin. Okay, Plutarch wrote in his book on Isis and Osiris that they got it on in their mother's womb, and she was married to Osiris. So she was not a virgin. Second, in order to get around this, in order to give birth to Horus, she was impregnated by the corpse of Osiris. So, and third, neither she nor Osiris pre-existed their birth. So that's just a bad parallel. If you want to talk about it being a weird birth, fine. Isis had sex with a dead corpse. It's necrophilia, but you know, we're not going to go there. I mean, it's really bad. So let's keep it rolling. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess you guys are now seeing a picture of me, but I just put this picture in there to illustrate the ridiculous fact that that the Nile Valley mythicists will try to get you to look at a picture and to come to the conclusion that Jesus never existed based on you seeing a picture. But if we took that logic to its most logical conclusion, I would have to discount me not existing because because they showed me a picture of Isis holding Isis holding Horus. But that's just, once again, that's just bad logic, because look at this sister holding her son. How many mothers have held sons throughout history? And this is utterly asinine, and it's not good scholarship. So let's keep rolling. Yeah, that's a I didn't know that we were having a hard time, but that baby couldn't tell. But let's keep rolling. Okay, what about the death? What about the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? Or we just believe that Paul and the other apostles plagiarized the tales of a dying and rising God, or a copycat tale of the Kemetic religions? Are we? No, I think not. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Osiris. It should be noted that Osiris is a contingent being who did not pre-exist his entrance in the so-called creation. Jesus taught that before the world was, that he was the great I am. Osiris is not the creator of the cosmos and at all reality, but is rather a part of it. The same cannot be said about Jesus. Gary Habermas and Mike Lacona summarize the Osiris myth as thus: Osiris was killed by his brother, chopped up into 14 pieces, scattered throughout Egypt. The goddess Isis collected and reassembled his part and brought him back to life. Unfortunately, she was only able to find 13 pieces. Moreover, it is questionable whether whether Osiris was brought back to life on earth or seen by others as Jesus was. He was given the status as God of the gloomy underworld. So the picture we get of Osiris is that of a guy who does not have all his parts and who maintains a shadowy existence as a god of mummies. Osiris' return to life was not a resurrection, but a zombification. Okay. Furthermore, Jesus was never identified with the natural processes like the Kemetic gods. Jesus was identified as Yahweh in the flesh and thus transcended over nature. And he came for the purpose of inaugurating the kingdom of God and dealing with man's sin problem. In the story of Osiris, we find none of this. An example of this is the fact that ancient Kemetic gods seemed almost captive within their own manifestation. They personify power but remain incomplete as personages. Regarding the Osiris myth, Metzger note whether this can rightly be called a resurrection is questionable, especially since according to Plutarch, it was the pious desires of devotees to be buried in the same ground where, according to local tradition, the body of Osiris was still lying. Edwin Yamauchi agrees it is a cardinal misconception to equate the Egyptian view of the afterlife and with the resurrection of the Hebrew Christian traditions. In order to achieve immortality, the Egyptian or the Kemetic had to fulfill 3 conditions. 1, his body had to be preserved, hence mummification. 2, nourishment had to be provided either by actual offering of daily bread, beer, all that good stuff. Magical depiction of food on the walls of the tomb. 3, magical spells had to be entered with the dead pyramid text on the Old Kingdom, coffin text in the Middle Kingdom, and the Book of the Dead in the New Kingdom. Okay, so it had to be entered in, these magical spells, with the pyramid text in the Old Kingdom, the coffin text in the Middle Kingdom, and the Book of the Dead in the New Kingdom. Moreover, the Egyptians did not rise from the dead. Separate entities of his personality, such as his Ba and his Ka, continued to hover over his body. Thus, to speak of Osiris as rising from the dead is a gross exaggeration. The Osiris myth has more to do with Frankenstein than it does to do with Jesus, right? Okay, so it's evaluation time, and I need to pick up the pace. So, let's evaluate. One of the best ways to evaluate is to take each parallel on head to head. So, we'll just flat out and say it. No Kemetic or so-called pagan savior god died from somewhere else. They were not saviors. If they were, prove it. Only Jesus died for sin. Okay? Jesus died once and for all. He is not to be identified with any vegetation cycles or solar cycles. He is Lord over the solar system. He is not to be identified with it. Jesus' death is recorded in actual history. Okay, and Jesus died voluntarily. Jesus' death was a triumph and not a defeat, right? Okay. A few more rebutting defeaters if that's not good enough. Okay, so number 1, time simply did not allow for legends and myth to enter into the gospel narrative, since many of the New Testament books were written fairly soon. Okay, there are good historical and textual reasons that exist for the conclusion that the Gospels were in fact penned at an early date. Moreover, the Christian creed in 1 Corinthians 15:3 is much older than the epistle in which it appears. Such early tradition often appears in the New Testament and consists of oral teaching and proclamations that were repeated until they were recorded. These creeds then actually predate the New Testament writings. Oh Lord. These creeds actually predate the New Testament writings in which they appear. Okay, for more on that, see page 30 of The Historical Jesus by Gary Habermas. Next, the apostles knew the difference between myth and factual history. And factual testimony, The apostles declared themselves the eyewitnesses of actual historical events. Furthermore, the writers paid careful attention to historical aspects. In doing so, they supplied intimate details of Jesus' times, names, dates, locations, events, and customs. You don't find things like that in myth. You just don't find it in myth. 3, the idea that the New Testament reports myth in regards to the life of Jesus rests on the assumptions that several generations passed in which myth would have the time needed to grow. Oxford scholar and of ancient Greek and Roman history, Anne Sharon White, has argued that the span of even 2 full generations is insufficient for myth and legend to accrue and distort historical fact. 4, it's pretty self-explanatory. If the gospel writers had exaggerated or departed from historical fact, enemies of the faith would have exposed them. Okay. 5, an analysis of the gospel accounts reveal that they bear no resemblance either in style or content to other well-known examples of mythical writing. An example of this is the fact that the miracles of Jesus are always done within the context of his ministry, specifically to give glory to God and to meet legitimate human needs. Okay. And lastly, any attempt to dismiss the Gospels as myth will involve circular reasoning. All right. So I want to close out with this. I'm going to give you a tale of 2 presidents. And can somebody tell me what time that I'm supposed to end so I can hurry up? I kind of lost myself. Finishing up. Okay. Imagine that we are 2,000 years in the future through some sort of cataclysmic event like the one going on now. Only a handful of documents of the history of the United States are available, and these are just fragments. After sifting through the fragments, a small group of historical enthusiasts come to a radical conclusion. The myth of President John F. Kennedy is based on the earlier myth of Abraham Lincoln. The reasons for such a conclusion is, hey, just look at the parallels. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. Lincoln and Kennedy each have 7 letters in their name. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. Both married in their 30s, a 24-year-old socially prominent girl who could speak fluent French. Both presidents dealt with civil rights movements for African Americans. Both presidents were assassinated on a Friday in the back of the head before a major holiday while sitting next to their wives. Both their assassins were known by 3 names consisting of 15 letters. John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and was captured in the theater. Booth shot Lincoln in the theater and was captured in the warehouse. Both assassins were shot and killed with a Colt revolver days after they assassinated the president before they could be brought to trial. Both presidents were succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson from the South, born in 1808 and 1908, respectively. This example shows that insignificant, spurious, false, and misleading parallels can be used to argue just about anything. All right, I do have a little bit of time. Great. Thank you so much for posting that. Now, I'm just going to show you guys some suggested books for reading. And these are some books that I found helpful. Feel free to write them down. Okay, so we have the Bible Amongst the Myths, Reinventing Jesus by J. Ed. I cannot pronounce his last name, but I'm pretty sure Dr. Eric Mason knows him because he went to DTS. I know he knows Dr. Daniel Wallace. Shattering the Christ Myth by James Patrick Holding. Come Let Us Reason by Paul Copen, William Lane Craig. Unmasking the Pagan Christ. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And that's by Richard Balcom. History Before 1950, Richard Carey. Okay. Y'all are probably asking yourself, why does he have a book by Richard Carrier and suggested, well, it's not a book. It's actually a little blog response. The reason why I have this by Richard Carrier is because if we look at the sources that are used by those who put forth the Nile Valley hypothesis, a lot of those sources rely on really dated information, information from Kersey Graves, information from Godfrey Higgins, information from Gerald Massey. One Kemetic went on to say that nobody has refuted Gerald Massey. Well, let me say a little bit about Gerald Massey. Gerald Massey writes in his own book that he did not provide certain citations for what he's saying, but they should take his word for it that he is backed up by Egyptologists in the field. Okay, I'm sorry, that's not empowerment. When you want to intellectually empower somebody or academically empower somebody, what you do is you put your source in your work. It does not matter if you wrote a book of 1,000 pages. If there are no sources in the book, it's garbage. And what Richard Carrier, who is a mythicist, he is not a Christian, and I will point out my issues with him, but I can agree with him on this. What Richard Carrier points out is that pretty much anything written by certain mythicists before 1950, and we can include James Frazier, who wrote The Golden Bough, T.A. Duane, and many others, any books by those type of guys is just simply garbage. It's simply garbage. It's not reliable because the sourcing is bad, and the method used by how they came up with their so-called parallels are also trash. Now, I didn't say that. Richard Carrier said that, and he is a mythicist. He is not a Christian. So it's garbage, and therefore you should be highly skeptical of anything written from a mythicist before 1950. A website that I have found extremely helpful is that called Tectonics. It is an apologetics website. It's by J.P. Holding, and I have a lot of his books and a lot of resources have came from him that I have and I've given away. All right, so now it's time for questions. What's up, y'all? So if you guys have any questions, I haven't learned how to work the function to put your questions on the video. I'm gonna learn that one day, but it's Q&A time. So who got a question? Let's just take a look. Anybody got a question? Anybody have any questions? Okay, well, since nobody has any questions, I want to just highlight a few things here. And I guess I was so concerned about not going fast enough. I guess I went too fast. And if Adam Coleman is out there, tell him he got 45 minutes to do the presentation. I was wrong. I thought it was like 30 minutes, but he has 45 minutes to do the presentation and 15 minutes to answer questions. Okay, so somebody got a question. Where would you say would be a great place to start for someone completely new to this? I would say I'll give you two places to start. Okay, two places to start is Reinventing Jesus by Wallace et al. And I put it on the suggested reading list where you can see it. Reinventing Jesus is a really good book. Reinventing Jesus is going to deal with about 4 areas. It's going to deal with mythicism. It's going to deal with textual criticism. It's going to deal with the reliability of the New Testament text. So you kind of you are kind of getting a nice survey of 3 areas. The next book is Unmasking the Pagan Christ. And let me see who Unmasking the Pagan Christ. I'm just going to look and see who wrote that real quick. I don't have it committed to memory. and it's also in my sources. But Unmasking the Pagan Christ by S.E. Porter and S.J. Bedard. So get those two books. That's a great place to start. Then I think that the next book to get is, I got it right here. Let me see here. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Okay, I hope you can see it. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Balcom. Okay, that's the next book to get. There are a lot of books, and I would say that my issue with any type of mythicist is they're only reading stuff that they like. If you look behind me, if I took you over to my little Egyptology section, I got plenty of books by them, but they don't deal with Christian scholarship, and Christian scholarship is not shying away from any of this. So we are taking it head on, and we are offering good reasons for which why we think we're right. Another book that you should get is this book right here, The Historical Jesus, Ancient Evidence for the Life of Christ by Gary Habermas. It's a good book. Okay, I saw somebody ask about Gerald Massey. Where can I find out more about Gerald Massey? Any books to recommend? Okay, Unmasking the Pagan Christ, and go to the Tectonics website and look at all the resources. J.P. Holden has some books that he's written. Look at all J.P. Holden's resources and things like that. Okay. How do you engage those who subscribe to this ideology? One, I engage those who subscribe to this type of ideology by getting them to realize, for one, that there are standards for doing historicity. If we held strictly to their standards to do history, meaning that you have to have writing on the wall, that you have to have statues, that you have to have bodies and things like that, we would be kind of in trouble if we dismissed any type of writing unless it's on a wall. If we dismissed not having a body and things like that, we would be in trouble of attempting to prove that chattel slavery happened. Yep, you would be in trouble if you held to that type of form of historiography, and nobody does historiography like that. So, also, don't be afraid of the parallels, but also set each parallel in its own context and deal with it then, and just expose certain fallacies of circular reasoning, special pleading. Just be ready to call it out, and ultimately you'll get to a point where it is not an intellectual issue; it's simply an issue of the heart, and that's where you make sure that you're praying for whatever person that you're praying for. But I mean, the bottom line is it's bad historiography. It's a bad method, and it's like IP told Matt Dillahunty. I don't care if you're not, and I'm using these words loosely, but he said, I don't care if you're not convinced. I'm going to keep presenting these reasons, and whether you're convinced or not, I'm gonna let the chips fall where they may. Now, flip side of that, the Holy Spirit is the one who converts, okay? But you are to present yourself as a vessel to be used by God, and you just never know. Oftentimes I'll deal with people, and we'll hash it out one day, and then they'll go re-indoctrinate themselves the next day listening to Dr. Ben and others, outdated information and things like that. And you just pray for people. But look, if you're concerned about truth, you should embrace truth. So let me see if I got some more questions. Okay, if I know a person who comes out the gate and says the Ten Commandments are a ripoff of Hammurabi, what would you say? Well, I'm gonna say the same thing that I said about I'm gonna say the same thing that I said about the laws of Ma'at. Well, and what is the biblical answer about why we have law codes? I'm gonna give you the biblical answer. One reason why we have certain law codes is the fact that human beings are made as image bearers of God. Okay, human beings are made as image bearers of God. Therefore, even as it says in Romans, where Paul is talking, God has written His law on our hearts. Okay, so we know the law of God innately. Okay, we know it. So I wouldn't at all be surprised that the Code of Hammurabi has certain laws. Now, the difference is context. Okay, the difference is context. So I'm going to always push context, and if a person just wants to ignore the context, it doesn't bother me one bit, because it's special pleading, and special pleading is fallacious. So I'm going to continue to push the context. A great book that deals with that, I'm going to give you about 2 books. One is by John Currid. Against the Gods. Okay. Against the Gods. And the other book is by John Oswalt. And it is the Bible amongst the myths. So let me see. We got any more questions? Any more questions? Okay, hold on. What do you really think of Vocab Malone? Vocab Malone is a good guy. I told Vocab Malone that he is the only pre-sup apologist that I know who has been willing to debate. And I was looking at one of his debates the other day against Richard Carey, and I thought he held his own in that debate. And he is one of the only, and he's one of the only precept apologists to debate the historicity of Jesus Christ, or even talk about the historicity of the or the reliability of the New Testament text. So Vocab Malone is my boy for that, and I appreciate him. He is a credit to presuppositionalist. So that's what I think of Vocab Malone. He's one of my he's good for that. Let me see here. We have anything else? Well, I want to say thank you all for attending this session. I would ask that you please hit the like button and help a brother out a little bit. Please subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that. Okay, so let me see here. We got any more questions? Let me see here. Any more questions? I'm just going through looking for some questions. You guys are welcome, and thank you. Let me see here. Any more questions? Sorry. All right. Well, we got about 5 minutes. So, the next thing that we're gonna do for the channel. Okay. So let me. James White is also a precept. I believe he debated the reliability of the New Testament. Yeah, and I appreciate that. He did. He debated Dr. Bart Ehrman. I also found. I thought that he did good against Robert Price. Now, I would love to see Dr. White put his energy into baiting a person like Richard Carey, because I think Dr. White would do a good job. I'm not sure why that has never happened yet. There was a debate that he did. It was a tag team debate that he did against John Dominic Crossan regarding the resurrection. So Dr. James White is not afraid to go there. He'll debate textual issues and things like that. But like I said, vocab got out there and got dirty with Richard Carrier and these radical mythicists. So I would like to see Dr. James White engage in more debates along those lines. But yeah. Well, you guys stay tuned, and I hope you guys enjoy Veda's presentation. I know I'm going to enjoy it. I cannot begin to tell you how I was scrambling within the last 3 days trying to get some stuff done for this, but I hope you guys were blessed by this. I hope that this will bless somebody else, and be looking for some more content to come out within the next few weeks. And let's just be prayerful and pray for one another and pray for this nation with everything that's going on. But at the same time, we can take great comfort in knowing that even when the hand of God is judging, God is also, just like he did with the death angel and the children of Israel, he's also in the business of showing grace and mercy and things like that. So why were you scrambling? Emails weren't good. No. I'm trying not to throw anybody under the bus. I'm not, and I'm talking about my wife, but my wife is a heck of a coach. And she was kind of cracking the whip on me a little bit to get the time right. And I thank God for my wife. So yes, we do have to, pray. But, we also have some time, because I'm going to probably be off work for a few weeks. We also have some time to read some books. And I'm late on some homework, and I'm going to try to get most of my homework turned in. But thank you guys for attending this session. God bless you all. Love you all. Deuces.